Hi, I want to make a video on this idea of compensation and how we're compensating usually. Um, I think it goes basically to this idea that when, say, you're not jealous, it's usually being made up for something, and say the opposite, the other feeling that you're feeling in reaction to a certain circumstance. So if you're not jealous, you're usually on a tipping scale where you're not jealous, but you're the opposite of jealous. Say maybe envious or whatever it is. You're generally compensating for a certain circumstance. Um, and let me just backpedal real quick and go on the main thing I want to describe this subject with. And the main idea is this idea that we're compensating for. Obviously, we're playing a zero-sum game, and that's exactly the idea that we're fighting against the negative, and the negative is the only outcome that we could possibly have, and it's about mitigating against the negative and trying to mitigate against a further negative and making sure the negative is as little as possible. And as we can only apply that moving forward into the future, moving forward and making sure that it can only we can only go into the future trying to eliminate the harm that we can possibly try to eliminate. Once the harm has been done, it can't be undone. Um, So generally speaking in life, like coping, we're compensating for generally speaking. You make a mistake and you compensate for it. So you forget something, you compensate for it by either going to pick it up or something. You learn your lesson not to forget something. And I've mentioned this before in other examples that by compensation, you learn your lesson early and therefore you're not going to make the same mistake um, that you may not realize you've been making mistakes before, or you learn your lesson earlier and you end up not making the mistake when it could possibly be much worse later on. And that's about the compensation. You make a mistake, but you learn from it, and or whatever it may be, whatever this any mechanism of reality, anything happening, any circumstance happening, not just applying it to psychology and human interaction or even sentient interaction, just interaction as a whole, and this universe, this reality, and how we're compensating for things. Something, an interaction, but I guess the best example and to use for this subject is human interaction. And yes, social practical circumstances. I'm describing social interaction between sentient beings, and that interaction is I'm compensating. I forget something, I compensate for it. I give you $5, you pay me back in compensation. $7 because you paid me back 2 days too late, or whatever it may be, to an extra dollar per day that you didn't give it back to me on the day that I asked for it. There's a compensation factor, and it goes back to this idea of equilibrium. I know I've mentioned this before, equilibrium, and it goes back to compensation. It's a if there's more lanes here, or if there's more people here, then more people are going to come in this line. And by definition, since there are more people in this line and more people want to get to the front of the line first, there's two lines, and people are going to start filling up the other line. And therefore, that line is going to fill up just like the other line because the other line was already filled up. Therefore, it's compensating or offsetting or whatever you want to describe it as. That line is compensating for the other line that's already been filled up. So the long line, the short line compensated for the long line because the long line caused the short line to get longer because um, the long line was long and people didn't want to get in the long line. The short line was short. Generally speaking, obviously, the short line could have a slow, say, like a store, a slow cashier, and the other people just get in the long line because the person's moving faster. And obviously, this is speaking generally, but you get the basic idea of a compensation, offsetting an equilibrium idea. And you can apply it to a certain extent about the fundamental nature of reality. Evolution, sort of like you have a good sense of smell and sight instead of just a good sense of smell, and you compensate from your lack of sight with a good sense of smell. Generally speaking, you'd apply this to general circumstances of reality, but applying it to the circumstances of a sentient being inside this reality completely breaks the thought experiment, or it's a complete straw man. It's a complete false premise when you're describing the idea of sentient beings experiencing something because you're applying it to a fundamental aspect of reality that you can't apply it to. You're not offsetting, you're not creating a compensation or an equilibrium in a person suffering from some negative circumstance or feeling pain because there's no offsetting that. You can say a person learns from their mistakes, but it's obviously, say a person um, learns from their mistakes, and they go through pain, and then they compensate for it, and therefore that creates an equilibrium, or whatever you want to apply it as. An equilibrium, say, I stubbed my toe, therefore I'm going to learn not to stub my toe anymore. So you learn to not stub your toe. You learn not to stub your toe anymore. You don't make the same mistake. Therefore, it creates some kind of equilibrium where, or compensation, or if I'm mixing the two words up now, some kind of compensation. And in a way, that can be applied to a certain circumstance like that. But it's not an equilibrium, because that idea is completely disconnected from the idea of feeling a certain circumstance, because it's not an equilibrium. You learned from a mistake, one mistake that you could have made, and offsets further mistakes you could have made, and that's not an equilibrium, that's just compensation. And that's a distinction between, say, compensation and equilibrium. I just thought I'd bring up equilibrium in a certain circumstance to describe, say, life in general, or the fundamental aspects of reality. There's no real equilibrium, because that's a contrived idea in and of itself, but describing it to best to find a way to describe reality, and some kind of value weight outside of our existence, and the hard science. There is a certain validity to a certain extent to that, but then again, it completely null and void, because it is a contrivance of a certain a contrived thought experiment, describing and creating certain circumstances, and certain circumstances to describe reality, and generally speaking. But I think compensation is a better word to say to describe reality than equilibrium, because compensation can be applied more vaguely, but more accurately to a certain circumstances, describing the sentient perspective, the value perspective, philosophy, and the hard science perspective of reality existing in and of itself. So yes, recompensate. You stub your toe. You learn to not stub your toe as much, and that's not an equilibrium. That's more of a compensation, where you compensate by you stub your toe, but you compensate for not stubbing your toe anymore, and that's not an equal and opposite reaction, because it can't be applied to the same circumstances, and it's not a tangible thing. It's just an interaction of tangible things based on certain circumstances that can't necessarily be applied to, say, as an equilibrium. And equilibrium is more about a hard science, but it can't be necessarily applied to hard science. And I guess this video has turned more into a comparison between equilibrium and compensation. But the compensation is, it's an intangible circumstance created between physical things interacting. Sort of like the idea of blaming the circumstance, blaming the your opportunity. You can only blame the circumstance, but you can't blame it, so you blame the things inside the circumstance, and the things that take credit, but you take credit for the circumstance. Therefore, you're going to have to take the fall for the circumstance. Say something happens, even though it's a circumstance that created your existence, you're going to take the fall for this, and you're going to take the fall, and that's going to be part of the circumstances. You taking the fall for the circumstance that created you to become the fall to begin with. So the circumstance creates you the victim, and you have to suffer being the victim of a circumstance, creating the circumstance that made you a victim to begin with. So you're taking the fall for these circumstances. And that's the same idea of compensation. You stub your toe, you learn not to stub your toe anymore. And that creates a compensation. And the same thing with learning from mistakes, learning from certain circumstances, and having that be a learning lesson. For whatever thing it may be. In many cases, you're not necessarily making up for the circumstances or compensating for the circumstances that you may have been a victim to, and therefore, but generally speaking, something's going to happen, and that's the illusion. Something's going to happen. It's going to happen one way, and once it's happened, it can't happen any other way. And compensation is just another word describing those circumstances of moving forward and hoping for the best of an interaction, based on an interaction that was going to happen regardless. So compensation is describing another contrivance, and describing the very linear nature of existence, very mechanical nature of existence. Even though there's a bunch of moving parts, it's very simple. It's a checkerboard, describing a bunch of moving pieces, but a bunch of moving pieces creating a very intricate pattern, causing things to interact in a certain way that seems complicated, but it's just a bunch of moving pieces moving at the speed of light, causing different pieces, because we're part of the speed of light moving. I'm made up of photons. I'm made up of a bunch of pieces moving at the speed of light. Everything's moving at the speed of light, but it's about moving at the speed of light outside of the speed of light. So I'm moving at the speed of light based on the movement at the speed of light, but obviously that can't happen. You can't move at the speed of light at the speed of light. Things can't move on the very basis, very fundamental aspects of your movement can't move at the speed of light and move at the speed of light on our level too, because that would just break it down and it wouldn't work in the same fundamental aspect. But I don't even know where that came from. I digress on that little segue. But yeah, we're compensating. Whatever circumstance you can think of, something's going to happen, and compensation is just another contrivance in describing the very mechanical linear nature of existence. And something's going to happen, and it describes more of a practical reality in which we're existing, practical reality in which we're existing, more than anything. I'm compensating for learning by, say, learning my lesson not to make the same mistake again, or I forget something, or I do this, describing specific circumstances, and I compensate by doing this. I go pick it up. Sometimes the compensation is, say, you forget something and you just have to go pick it up, but you compensate by, say, something else is going to happen, and say something else is going to happen. You say a surprise that something you didn't know was going to happen becomes part of this compensation, but that compensation was contrived because you realize that something was going to happen anyway, and what happened was what's going to happen. You apply that to the past and understanding that it's caused by a bunch of interactions, and that describes in and of itself that things have an interaction, but also that something was going to happen anyway, and what happened in the past was going to happen. It was going to happen because of interactions that happened, and that's, I think, to a certain extent, like I've said before, people can understand those, at least those basic ideas, but they don't necessarily understand the concept as a whole, or at least accept it as a whole. Yeah, so it's compensation, I think, better describes the circumstances. It's a less overt contrivance in describing the circumstances of reality than, say, something like an equilibrium, describing our existence or our reality. So we're living more in a compensation more than an equilibrium. If to make a distinction at all, an irrelevant distinction, but a relevant one enough that I've made throughout the video. So yes, we're compensating more than anything. I think that's all I need to say. Obviously, I don't think I described everything the best I wanted to, but I'm not really in the mood to make videos right now, but I almost have an obligation to make videos at this point, so it's hard not to make videos when you've made it a thing. So, yeah, that's basically the idea, and I want to use a better example to describe the situation. I use, say, forgetting something, and something's going to happen anyway, and you describe just a matter-of-fact circumstance that just happens to happen out of nowhere, not based on any expectation you have. You just blame the circumstance created based on that mistake that you want to compensate for, and you make that part of the compensation. In the end, something's going to happen a certain way, and compensation is still a contrivance in describing the deterministic mechanism of the universe, of this reality. And it's less of a contrivance, I would say, than, say, something like an equilibrium, even though that can be vaguely applied in a certain contrived circumstance in describing reality. I think compensation is a little more vague and a little more broad in describing the circumstances of reality, and almost in a way a little more exact, or more exact, actually, in a way far more exact in describing the circumstances of reality. So, yes, you're compensating. You forget something. I think that's the best circumstance. You make a mistake, you regret something, and that regret makes you learn from your mistakes. And generally speaking, that's how it happens. You deter against something, or you do something better. It's about deterring. And even if you do something, you take a proactive measure against for doing something, it's usually deterring, based on making a deterrence or learning from a mistake that you feel like you have some kind of built-in logic or mechanism of ethics in which you feel like you've made a mistake, and it usually works, and you did something you feel like was wrong, and therefore you compensate by doing something in the opposite way. By learning from mistakes, you make a mistake, you do something wrong, and therefore you take a different action or learn it. And this can be applied to any circumstance describing an inanimate object, um, or just the very nature of the flow of time of things moving and taking their passage in the way of the trail of tears moving forward. So yes, compensation is a good way of describing it. And you make a mistake, you compensate for it, and you learn not to make the mistake again. You stub your toe once, you won't do it more times. You'll try to do your best to make sure you didn't have to do it, but you had to learn your lesson first to realize the lesson had to be learned. And sometimes you don't learn a lesson until it's too late, or you learn a lesson, never learn a lesson, but the likelihood of that happening, the expectation is that you're going to learn a lesson. If you don't learn a lesson, you didn't know there was a lesson to learn to begin with. So the lesson's going to be learned, or it's not going to be learned. And if you don't learn the lesson, you don't realize that's to be learned, or you don't realize there's a lesson to learn, but you expect the lesson to be learned, and almost there's an obligation to recognize the lesson to be learned. And once you realize there's a lesson, you haven't taken that lesson to be learned. So it's down to lessons now. So yes, we're learning our lesson, and it's about compensating from saying the mistakes or the compensation factor, generally speaking, about reality. Sort of like I mentioned with the line, describing more about reality and psychology more than anything in our interaction with the reality and our existence in this reality created by the reality, and so on and so forth. Just part of the reality, interacting with the reality. And we're existing inside of it, and we're compensating, and a good way is describing as mistakes that we make, and compensating for those mistakes by not learning from them and mitigating against but we obviously have to learn the lesson first, or make the mistake. And same thing with, say, the line thing. It makes up for the line, generally speaking, that can be applied to certain circumstances like that. And say, like evolution, you make up for the eyes, so your sight, because you're lacking sound, and therefore you have better sight than sound. Than, say, a person that has sight and sound. A blind deaf person is better at, say, feeling things, making a distinction between feeling things, and, say, a person that can see, feel, touch, hear, taste, and all that kinds of stuff. They have more senses, therefore less goes into those senses, and that can be applied. And those are a few good examples. At least you get the point that I'm trying to describe. And I think that's all I need to say. Sorry, this was another drony video, so thank you, and I'm sorry it went on too long anyway. So thank you, and until next time, bye.